So I'm just starting the recording now. Today is our final week of looking at Plato. We've covered quite a lot of ground in the last 5 weeks. Four weeks, sorry. This is the 4th week. And we've looked at the early dialogues, the middle dialogues, and today we're going to look at a couple of the late dialogues of Plato. Obviously there's a lot of material to go through and all of that, and we've just touched on some of the important parts of some of the important dialogues. And I have emphasised that when you're reading through the material, not to get discouraged if it doesn't make too much sense to you, because with these things it can take a while for it to start to make sense to you, depending on what you've read before or what your background is. So, don't beat yourself up or get discouraged about that. Just if something does jump out at you as being something that you can think about a bit more, just stay with that and think about it. And I also did give a few tips on how to read these materials, what sort of questions we should ask. Parmenides is what we're doing today, and it is actually the most difficult or enigmatic of the dialogues. It's highly metaphysical. You'd say very philosophical in a very abstract and specialised way. You might say it's the least difficult to see how there's a practical application of it, although there is. The other text we'll look at when we're discussing the text and reading it is going to be the Timaeus, which deals with Plato's cosmology, or his account of how the world came to exist. So what I'll do now is, we do only have an hour or so. I'll just give an overview. The first thing I'm going to do is turn to what's called, in philosophy we call it the matter itself. And what that's to do with is for a moment we abstract from the historical text. We abstract from trying to do exegesis on this particular text, but think about the substantive issues that are being discussed in themselves, because that can then help us to understand the text. So the matter itself, and this is, you don't need to know this, but that's a German term translated to English, Sache selbst. So we're looking at the matter itself first. And I'm going to, because it can be quite hard to see, well, what's the significance of the Parmenides? Why are they even talking about these themes? What's going on here? I wanted to introduce you to the themes in this way first. So often it's called the problem of the one and the many. It can also be called the problem of universals. And different philosophers will have different ways of tackling this problem or this question with their own theory of universals. So let's define some terms first. What is a universal?
overall?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. A universal is a reality or a feature or a property that can be present in many things at once. And I'm jumping ahead here because it's not until Aristotle do you get this distinction. It doesn't really come up much in Plato, but you've got this distinction between essential and accidental properties, or the essence and the accidents of a thing. So an example of a universal that's the essence would be humanness. So this is to do with what kind of thing something is. So we can think of lots of universals in this category, essential. We've got humanity. And when I say the word humanity here, I don't mean the human race, but that's how we often use the word. I mean what would be in each human being that makes them a human being. The humanity of Socrates, the humanity of Jack, the humanity of Jesus, the humanity of the Buddha, I suppose. But then we've got accidental forms, properties or realities that can be present in multiple things but don't describe what it is. So you'd have redness, shortness, being hot or cold. And you can describe these in different ways. You could say red. You could say red is present in a post office, a letterbox. Red is present in an apple. We can say redness. There's nothing that significant about it.
Suppose here, is it the same as when they use accidentals with references to the Eucharist?
Yes, because essence and substance most of the time are interchangeable. Accidents are to do with the external appearances, whereas the substance is what it is. So the substance of the Eucharist is the body and blood, soul and divinity of Christ, according to Catholic teaching, but the accidents stay the same, because the accidents are the appearances, what it looks like, what it tastes like, and even the fact that there's an alcoholic. You can't say it's alcohol anymore, can you? But the fact that you could, if you had a lot of that consecrated wine, it would still make you a bit tipsy. So that's an accident as well. Anyway, coming back to this. So universals, it's a reality or a property or a form that's repeated in many things. And the problem with the one and many is just, it really comes down to this. What's the relation between this one reality, for example, humanness, and all the different instances? So the word that we use in philosophy is, we could say instances, particulars, examples, individuals, and there's many of them. So when it comes to property or reality or form of humanity, that is the universal, and that is present. It's an ingredient in many instances, and those instances would be John, Jack, Bob, Mary, Socrates, Plato, and so forth. And the verb that's often used is instantiation. So humanity is instantiated in Plato, in Socrates, in Margaret Thatcher, and so forth. Or you could use it this way: it's exemplified in different examples. What the Parmenides is mostly about is this. It's all well and good to say that there's one universal, such as humanity, present in many things, but when you start to ask questions about how that works, all sorts of problems arise. And the character Parmenides is showing some of the paradoxes that arise when you try and think these things through. So obviously Plato wrote it. The dialogue, scholars would say that that dialogue is not an actual dialogue that happened. It's just a fictional one. But it involves Parmenides, Zeno, Socrates, and a couple of other characters. Do you remember what did Parmenides and Zeno have in common?
Were they both pre-Socratic philosophers?
Yes.
When they lived?
Yes. Parmenides was the teacher of Zeno, and they all emphasised oneness, and they had arguments to say that there's just one reality and that plurality is an illusion, and that change is an illusion. But Parmenides himself, not the dialogue, Parmenides himself was very much an influence on Plato, as I said in the first week. Okay, are you okay with this so far? Just a general picture? Okay, so what we're going to do now is try and make some sense, think of some theories about how individuals relate to a universal. And the examples that are given in this text, often they talk about oneness. So, and this makes it extra difficult because that's more abstract again. So, everything that exists is a unity. It's one in some way. I'm not just a random collection of parts that happen to be in the same space. There's some sort of organic unity to me, all right? Anything that exists, and this is what Aristotle would emphasize in a much more sophisticated way later, everything that exists is one. It's an indivisible whole, even though it has parts. And what Socrates says in this dialogue is that is this rule, which is that if any individual has a certain feature, I'll start that again. If an individual is, I'm going to put a space here. Just going to make sure this is recording still. Yep. If an individual is, let's say, P, then there is a universal that there's a universal that there's a universal that the individual partakes in. I'm going to change this to X. And I'm going to say the individual is S. S for subject. So whenever we make a statement about something, we use this subject predicate form. So we'd say Bob is angry, the bird is beautiful, the salad is tasty. Okay? So you've got a subject, you're pointing out the thing that we're talking about, and then the property we're ascribing to it. And remember, those properties could be essential or accidental. So Socrates' theory in his middle dialogues is that there's two things going on here. One is that sentences have this form. Two is that reality has that form. So in reality, there are individuals that are objectively certain properties, X. So in reality, Bob is objectively a human being. But then that structure is then mirrored in our thoughts and in our sentences. We have these structures in our thoughts. We ascribe to Bob the fact that he's human, and we say it as well, all right? And where does the universal come in? Well, Socrates would say this is possible in reality as an objective thing because there is a universal X-ness. Just calling it X-ness for now. But we can also call it a universal idea or form. So, we've got a fact. The fact is that Bob is human. We've got a thought, which is the judgment that we make when we take the notion of Bob, the notion of human, and we compose them together and say Bob is human. And then we've got a sentence that expresses that. But the more fundamental connection here is in reality first, objective reality. So we've got a fact, Bob being human. Now, Socrates says that if Bob is human, that means he is he's partaking in this universal called humanness or humanity. So here we get the many individuals, because we can have many human beings. Each of those human beings is human. How is that possible? Socrates says, because they're all participating in this universal called humanness. You can describe this in different ways. You can say humanness, humanity. You can say man. There's different emphases there. Man sounds more concrete because you're talking about a whole thing, even though you're not talking about a particular man. You're talking about man, whereas humanity is described in a less concrete way. But that's a bit of a side note. What are your thoughts so far, by the way? Do you think this is arbitrary? I mean, what do you think? Can you see why you'd have to posit this universal? Or do you think it looks just arbitrary and too much scaffolding that we don't need?
You wonder, first of all, what's his purpose? Why is he doing that? And then secondly, I've been thinking about different states that the individual could be in, some of which are sort of concrete, in other words, comparative, like the word Bob is handsome or Bob is beautiful, as opposed to Bob is human. So that's more where I am too, because I can't sort of put the statement into a picture which gives me a an hiccup as to why he's...
Why would he do that? Yeah. Yep. All right. Yeah, that's good. So, yeah, when we're trying to make sense of theories, that's definitely the way to go. You think, why is he saying that? What would lead someone to have that theory? It's not necessarily helpful just to say, well, he has that theory, because it's not satisfying as an answer when you're trying to make sense of a text. And you say, well, why? What's the reason for it? What's the meaning of it? Well, I'll give you some arguments why you would want to say this. We recognize humanity in many human beings. And it seems necessary to say humanity is the same in different human beings. Humanity is the same reality, has the same intelligible content. Because let's contemplate for a moment the opposite of that. Let's say that wasn't the case. Let's say every time I saw a human being, there wasn't the same thing. The concept was always different. That wouldn't make sense. Because when we make sense of the world, we have to try and compare different individuals to the same concept, to try and class them together. We can obviously do that in the wrong way. We can categorize things differently. But supposing that we're doing it well, when we see a bunch of individual things and we say, oh, that's a human being, that's a human being, that's a human being, how is that possible? And Socrates' answer is, well, each time you're intuiting the same universal, and that universal is humanity. All right?
Sorry, are you saying that by using different individual cases, it's almost a way of defining what the universal is?
The fact is that when we understand intellectually what James is, and we say James is a human being, we're actually seeing a reality or a meaning that is not just constrained to him. It can be exemplified in lots of other cases. So what we see is we're seeing a reality that transcends that individual and can be exemplified in other things. All right. So if you were to see, let's say that you went on a safari and it was the 1800s and you saw an animal that no one had ever seen before. I don't know, let's call it a pink ape, right? And you gave it a name. You would understand by that there could be another instance of that. So what I'm trying to explain there is that when we understand an individual, we're understanding them under a certain concept that we know it could apply to other things. It might not, that might be the only pink ape in existence, but we know that it could in principle, right? And so Socrates is saying, when we understand things, we're always looking in terms of universal concepts. Because to understand things, we need to categorize them in terms of what sorts of things they are. And when we do that, we're always abstracting and focusing on realities that could be present in other things as well, right? And then Socrates has the answer, well, how is that possible? What are we actually seeing? So the first thought is, in some sense, there is one reality. In some sense. We can leave that vague for the moment. We don't know exactly what that means yet, but humanity must be one reality because we're recognizing it multiple times, right? So that is one being, one form over many. That's what the one over many is, all right? But then we get, from there, I mean, this is only the beginning. This is, our problems haven't started. I mean, most people would agree with that, but then once we try and make sense of that metaphysically, it gets quite, well, we've been thinking about this for 2,000 years and
You've explained
longer,
it,
sorry.
You've explained it before, but I keep losing the meaning of metaphysics.
Metaphysics is, you could see, is the study of the deep structure of reality, even if it's invisible.
Right.
So for Aristotle, physics is the study of anything that you can see that moves, that can be moved and moves. Metaphysics would be the study of all reality whatsoever. Yeah. So think about physics, the study of physical things. Metaphysics is the study of that deeper level of reality, how reality is structured. Yeah.
With what we're doing here, aren't we sort of going from what in modern terms we'd call zoology, or the form of person, how they're made up, and the psychology,
Yep.
which is another complete
Yep.
different area, which goes into why people act the way they do.
Yeah.
Think the way they do.
Yeah. What happens when we do ask these metaphysical questions about form? We inevitably then start to go into, to make our questions more concrete, we start to think about what is the unity of a human person. And because a human person's a living being and a thinking being, we will start thinking about biology and psychology. However, the way that it's done in modern terms might not actually help us. It needs to be done in a more philosophically aware way, I think. Yeah. Because philosophy these days doesn't have an overarching guiding presence with the sciences. People aren't really philosophically trained very well anymore, so they inevitably will bring their philosophies in to their physics or the mathematics or the biology, but they're not aware of what they're doing. And the second problem with that is that all the different disciplines are all divided from each other. There's no overarching picture that can bring them all together, and that was different in the Middle Ages.
The modern sciences are objective, aren't they? They measure.
Well, I wouldn't use the word objective there because that's not what you mean is empirical. Yeah. I mean that brings up a whole other question. But yeah, there are definitely advantages of the modern method. Yeah. And the task of philosophers, particularly Thomistic philosophers who follow Aquinas, is to try and incorporate these modern methods and insights into the philosophy of nature again. All right, so I'm going back to where I was. Check the time. So one way of explaining how things can be of the same kind or the same class is to say they all partake in the same universal or form. And you give this universal a reality, an objective reality of some sort.
Is that by definition?
A universal?
Yeah.
There's different ways of thinking of a universal, but on this theory, universals are real. All right? But there's different ways of cashing that out, different ways of understanding what that is. And this is the real problem that philosophers struggle with is, okay, universals are real, but what does that mean? In what sense are they real? Okay. When you read Plato's theory of universals, often it sounds as if he's saying that the universal man is a man. It sounds like there is a subsisting horse, that's the perfect horse, the ideal horse, and that all individual horses somehow imitate that perfect horse. It sounds like that sometimes. I mean, people might interpret it differently. So that's one way of, if you're going to say that this is real, one way is Platonic realism. And that is that the universal, such as humanity or man with a capital M, man itself, or horseness or horse triangle, is to say that these universals are real in themselves, they subsist in the heavens. It sounds as if he's saying that they are individuals, like this super individual that all the other individuals down here on earth imitate or participate in, right? Can you see any problems with that?
I think about the end of last week's chapter where it was saying that knowledge was real and ignorance was unreality. Belief was sort of stuck somewhere between those extremes. When you're saying real there, is that what you mean by that?
Real means a feature of objective reality. Even if we're not thinking about it, it's there. And so knowledge discovers realities that are there. So something's real if our mind has to discover it, and we have to have the discipline to discover what reality is like. Whereas something that's fictional, we can just make it up, and it doesn't have any existence except for in our own minds. All right, Platonic realism. That's one theory. Another theory, the opposite extreme, is called nominalism. And that's that universals don't have any objective reality. It's called nominalism because this theory says that a universal, it's just a name that we give to things. There's no objective universal form in reality. It's just a name that we give to things. So when I say all apples are red, I'm using two universals there. I'm using the universal apple and red. The nominalist says there's no apple as such has got no reality. It's just a name, and that's all. Red is not real, it's just a name. Think about that for a second. Think about that theory. Do you think that would work?
To the extent that the colour red is really what we see reflected light with the blue spectrum taken.
Yeah, okay. Well, red can be not a good example because then you have that complication. So I'll think of another feature that we'd agree is there in reality. Let's say heat or velocity or something like that. Yeah.
Why would you say that the apple is not real? It's just the name of something.
It's not saying. The nominalist doesn't say that apple's not real. But the nominalist is saying the only thing that is objectively real are the individual apples. They don't participate in any one reality that's in common in all of them. Okay? Plato is saying there's some reality, some principle that's somehow related to or incorporated in, it's a bit vague, each apple or each human being. The nominalist says, no, get rid of that. Get rid of that principle. There's just individuals.
So if that's the case, then the problem for me would be, how can we communicate?
Exactly. Yes, that's right. And the other problem with this, well, the objection would be, when we're coming up with names of things, is it just arbitrary what names we give to things, or do our names somehow reflect what things are like? And if they're reflecting what things are like, then surely there must be some feature there in objective reality, and that's why you'd be tempted to say, well, there must be real in some sense. So, can you see how you've got problems with this theory? Because it seems a bit fantastic to say that there's this ideal realm and there's a perfect human and a perfect horse and so forth. But you want to avoid this as well. So there is a middle ground. And that's Aristotle's view. And Aquinas' view. And Platonic realism says that universals exist prior to individuals. So even prior to the existence of individuals, there are these forms that exist. The middle view, the middle ground, moderate realism, is that universals do exist, but only in things. If there were no human beings, humanity would not exist.
And if there were no human beings to try to categorise things, would the universals actually exist, or would the nominalism be equally valid?
Good question, yeah. So we've got, they exist, I have to check this Latin in a minute, but in rebus, in real things. And nominalism is, I think it's post rebus, but I'll have to look it up. So for nominalists, universals don't exist in things, they're just in our mind or in our speech. In our language, in our speech, or in our mind. So they're a subjective thing. There's two versions of realism. One, here, universals are real, but only in individuals. They sort of depend on individuals in order to exist. Platonic realism says that they exist, they subsist in themselves, and individuals participate in them. Now, I've taken a lot of time to give you the background of this Parmenides, but it's sort of necessary. I mean, it's very difficult to explain to you what on earth is going on in this text, what's the significance of it, until I give you this stuff, all right? So that's the background, the matter itself, as I said. And what goes on in the dialogue is that Parmenides comes along and he sort of plays the old and wise character who's been around longer and has thought about things for longer. And he challenges Socrates. And Socrates has his theory, which I've laid out, which is Plato's theory. And now that theory actually comes from the middle dialogues. It's in the Republic, it's in the Phaedo, it's in the Meno. And Parmenides starts taking him to task and saying, well, it doesn't work. There's all sorts of paradoxes. One of them is this. He asks him, well, this universal, you say it's present in multiple things. So there's a human form that's present in multiple humans. Okay. Is it split up into pieces? Right? Or is the whole thing present in each one? All right? So this is an interesting move, because he's saying it's got to be one or the other, right? Which one is it? It's what's called a dilemma. There's two ways to go, and both of them don't seem to work. Neither of them seems to work. So you've got the theory that it's like a pie. So humanity is like a pie, and everyone gets a piece of the pie. Right? And in different ways, Parmenides says, well, this leads to all sorts of contradictions. One of them being that if different things participate in smallness in order to be small, then they're all getting a piece of smallness. But then smallness must be bigger than all the pieces of smallness, which means smallness is big.
But is a characteristic divisible? Is another?
Yeah, that's a thing. It's a thing, and that would be a good response. Is that but there are objections. The good thing about the objections is it's forced Plato and others and us to actually delve deeper into what's going on here. What is the relation between the individual and the universal? There are other paradoxes, but I'm just going to move forward. If we go to the other horn of the dilemma, everything is whole in each thing. So humanity is wholly present in every person here. Now that sounds right, doesn't it? Because that means we're all sort of equally human. That sounds good to me. But Parmenides says, well, if you've got the same universal present in multiple things completely, and if each of these individuals is a separate being, that means that the one thing is separate from itself. You can see the thought process there. If you've got humanity, which is wholly present in person A, person B, person C, person D, you've got these persons all separate from each other. That means in some weird way the universal is one, and yet it's divided from itself. How's that possible?
Yes, I can see what you're saying, but then I would say, look, humanity is only one characteristic of what we're looking at.
Yeah.
It's not the only characteristic.
Yeah, there's other characteristics that make them different.
That's right.
You're right, you could say, insofar as they are human, they are one. But insofar as they are different bits of flesh or different personalities, they're different. But yeah, you're on the right track there. Yeah. So there are two paradoxes. There are others. But yeah, in the time we have, we've got 10 minutes left. I just wanted to give you a sense of what is the context in terms of the matter itself, the problems, and then what's going on in the dialogue. So first we've got Parmenides challenging Socrates. And then we've got Socrates attempting to answer it. Parmenides then says, he basically says about Socrates that he's too young and he's been too eager to come up with a theory, And if he was wiser like Parmenides, he would know that it's not that easy. All right. But of course, we know that Plato wrote this, so Parmenides is expressing Plato's ideas later, and Socrates is sort of a role of a younger version of himself. Now, remember when you said here, if we were nominalists, we couldn't have meaningful conversations with each other. That's exactly what Parmenides says. He says, look, I've given you all these paradoxes, and it looks like these are fatal objections to the theory of universals. But then he says, but we know universals must be real in some sense, otherwise we couldn't have meaningful conversation. Right? So we've got a problem. Parmenides is raising a problem. There's all these objections, contradictions that seem to attend Plato's theory of universals, his realism. But we still need realism in order to avoid this, in order to have conversation and philosophy and science and realism as a possibility. So the next step that happens is Parmenides, and I haven't looked at this part in detail, it's very difficult. It has 8 deductions to explain a deeper theory. It's quite esoteric, really, how to think about universals in a deeper way. It's like it's trying to preserve the theory but with something more elaborate, which we can't go into today. One reason for that is because I don't fully understand it, but I know in general what it is. That theory later on gets taken up by the Neoplatonists, and it's seen as, like, I guess you could say it's a bit like a scripture that they use to try and intuit the nature of reality as a whole. Like these 8 deductions, they try and use them as clues for understanding this elaborate theory of metaphysics. So that's another reason why the Parmenides is significant. So just to summarise, what's the significance of the Parmenides? Well, it's a late dialogue. So this is when Plato starts to reflect on the theories that have been developed in the middle period, raise objections, answer those objections. It's like a mature attitude. Parmenides takes that attitude in relation to the forms of the universals, and the 8 deductions that are proposed there then get injected and appropriated by the Neoplatonists. But if you were to do, a long-term study on these problems of the universal individual, this would be one of those classic texts to look at.
It's a bit like Plato's writing a play, isn't it? But he's using real characters.
Yes.
And so when is he using those real characters' ideas, or are they all his ideas?
They're his ideas.
All his ideas.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that he agrees with each of them. But in order to unfold his own ideas, he has them interact with someone else's ideas. And so in the back and forth, the disagreement, the refinement of ideas, it's like a polemic that forces his own ideas to be refined.
Well, this is what Socrates did, wasn't it? He'd have conversations.
Yes.
With people to refine and define.
Yes, but Plato was doing it at a higher theoretical level. Yeah. Theoretical, a more elaborate metaphysics.
Yes.
It's called dialectic. So dialectic is can mean a lot of things. Different contexts it means different things, but dialectic, it's dia meaning two or between two, or separation between two. And lectic is conversation.
So that's where Hegel got it from.
Yeah. So dialectic would just mean you've got two, they're not necessarily polemically opposed, but they're different points of view or different emphases, and you get them and you sort of make them fight out a bit. And I mean, that's what happens in conversations often. You know, you've got two people with slightly different points of view, and you struggle with it and you go back and forth, and something new comes out. Sometimes the word dialectic is used in a more polemical way, where you've got actual contradictions, and those contradictions might actually be physical, like a war between communism and Western democracy, or it might be a contradiction and polemic between two philosophies of life. And as you said, Hegel tries to see a common pattern through all these things. So you've got these different principles that fight each other, and then something new comes, and history evolves in this way. And a lot of that comes from Heraclitus, because Heraclitus's basic principle of reality was fire, polemos. All right, time for cuppa. Unless you've got another question.
I was just going to ask you, when the Neoplatonists, when's that era?
Okay. You've got Middle Platonism, which is about, from memory, I have to check this, 200 to 400. I'm going to have to check this. I have to see when Plotinus was alive. Plotinus would be the main Neoplatonist, and Middle Platonism was in between Plato and Plotinus. Oh, here we go. Yeah, sorry, I was wrong. Plotinus was about 200 to 270 AD, or CE if you prefer. Middle Platonism it's about 100 BC.
So Neoplatonism is about 280.
Yeah.
So is there any
There is, I'll just turn this off.